Hi folks, thanks for joining me today. My name is Anand Sundaram and I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager with the group that builds products like Windows Server, System Center, and other hybrid cloud services. I work very closely with the Azure team. I'm here to talk to you and show you the Microsoft Azure Stack, which is a new product offering that's meant to literally get Azure to your data center so that you can consume and deliver it to your internal constituents on your own terms, right? This offering has come about based on a lot of feedback and requests from you guys saying, hey, I love Azure. I use it today in a public cloud context. How do I get Azure to run in my own data center, right? So we've seen a lot of interest from you guys, and Azure Stack is the way we do that for you. So you might be seeing, or you might be very familiar with this view here, right? Which basically talks about how Azure is built, right? A bunch of infrastructure at the bottom, some infrastructure services, a lot of platform services on top. So Azure Stack, so think of Azure Stack conceptually as the vehicle that models this whole view top to bottom, except that you can deploy it in your data center, right? So we will figure out and be thoughtful about the infrastructure services and the platform services that are the most useful to you, right? So that if you're an IT pro, you get to stand up those infrastructure services and deliver them to your developers, right? And if you're a developer, you get a bunch of ready-to-use platform services and infrastructure services for your apps, right? So we will be very thoughtful about how we bring Azure to your data center through Azure Stack. But this is kind of the frame of reference that we're going to use as we bring Azure Stack to you. The first question that we should ask is, gosh, what is the motivation for Microsoft to bring Azure to your data centers via Azure Stack, right? And for that, we are taking a very close look at what is happening in the industry and the market around us, right? So today, apps are really the real currency of business, right? A lot of you might have been in situations where, line of business owners, like maybe the chief marketing officer or the chief sales officer comes and tells your line of business IT teams, hey, I need an application to launch a campaign in 3 days, right? And then you guys or your line of business guys go to IT and say, hey, can I get some infrastructure to build this app for my business? And then IT says, hey, I need a few days or maybe a couple of weeks to do that. And in the meantime, what happens is the developer who is instructed to build that app, they would just say, gosh, rather than twiddling my thumbs, I'm just going to go to the public cloud and swipe my credit card and get my work done, right? I'm sure a lot of you have seen this movie before. You're not alone if you've seen that. We are seeing that roughly 40% of what would have been traditional IT budget is being directly spent by the business themselves, right? And the reason for that is that IT, in spite of their best intentions, doesn't have the necessary platform, the processes, the technology required to deliver applications at the pace that businesses are looking to them for, right? So we believe that there's a great transformational opportunity here, right? So that, if you're a developer, IT, you kind of join forces and almost transform the way you deliver apps to your business. And our intent is to empower you with the platform and the technology and the process experience that we have from our experience running Azure and get it to you for deployment in your own data centers. So that's kind of the primary motivation that we have behind the Microsoft Azure Stack. And what does that transformational opportunity look like, right? So I wanted to give you a sense of that opportunity by sharing our experiences running Azure data centers at such large scale. As we go through this discussion, you can almost compare and contrast this as the traditional way of doing things versus the new way of doing things, right? So traditionally, you run a bunch of servers, you run a bunch of infrastructure, and you offer them up to your application owners, right? But then we want you to mentally, going forward, think of the fact that you are offering a set of services or application services, on behalf of your business to your internal developers. So I think we are asking that you make a little bit of a mental shift between how you've run data center operations traditionally versus how you would want to do it going forward, given the background that I just discussed. So if you look at a traditional data center, a lot of you guys would have built a bunch of apps where you almost literally hard code or tie the application to the underlying infrastructure, right? And this has happened over a period of time. I know that, you have done it, I've done it, everyone has been used to doing things that way, right? But what we do at Microsoft and in Azure data centers is that we almost set the application free from the infrastructure, as it were, right? We build the application as a bunch of composable components so that you almost get rid of the dependency on a particular server or a particular piece of infrastructure. That just allows the application to almost be built and deployed independent of where the infrastructure resides. The second piece is a lot of us are used to just using gold-plated hardware, as it were, right? Very expensive things, need to feed the beast constantly, right? Pay vendors a bunch of money or a lot of money to keep that thing up and running all the time, right? Many cases over-provisioned. What we are saying is that you want to walk towards a model which is much more standardized, homogeneous, use basic servers, right? And have the magic of software do all that, all the creation on top, right? Be it the type of infrastructure services that you need to run or platform services, everything being delivered in software as opposed to taking strong hardware dependencies. The third piece is just the way traditional data center mentality works, right? Where something breaks, right? The storage team says, hey, my storage runs fine. The networking team says, my networking is fine too. Same for compute, right? But then the clock is ticking and the business application is down, right? In contrast to that, the way we run in Azure is that both the developer and the operators of an application service carry a pager, right? So there is a chance that they might be woken up at 2 a.m. in the night and they take full accountability to figure out what's going on and how to fix it, right? Again, a very significant shift in mentality that all of us are going through at Microsoft, and we encourage you guys to do that as well. And then finally, we've spent years in IT over a period of time. We've built a bunch of scripts, a bunch of very custom deployment approaches for each application or each type of infrastructure SKU that we have in our environment, right? So you will quickly realize that if you want to meet the need for speed and the demands of your business, you need to get out of that mode of operation and make things much more simplified, much more streamlined, right? Just one operating system image as opposed to 42, right? Or just one type of hardware, setup guide as opposed to 20 different deployment guides for different hardware SKUs, right? And things like that. So basically, just the shift from servers to services is a pretty significant one, and we believe that we can shortcut that journey for you by sharing our best practices, our processes, and frankly our cloud platform, which is Azure, to you in your data center in the form of the Microsoft Azure Stack. To zoom in a little bit more into what makes up the anatomy of Azure, right? So if you think about it in simple terms, what Azure is about, it's a bunch of cloud infrastructure at the bottom, right? Think of millions of machines which just run storage, networking, compute. On top is a bunch of infrastructure services and platform services that you saw earlier, right? Which actually provide the software that leverages the underlying set of cloud infrastructure. And then you've got a portal, right? Using which your application owners access these underlying resources to deploy their apps, right? And the apps themselves could be running Windows, Linux. They could be a combination of traditional and modern apps, right? So that's what Azure is about, right? Today, roughly 57% of the world's Fortune 500 companies use Azure, right? And they're running a bunch of Windows and Linux apps. Some of them are new, much more modern. Others have been existing for a while and they lifted and shifted. So that's what Azure is about, right? And what we are essentially doing with Azure Stack is get that same anatomy to you for deployment in your on-premises data center, right? So if you think about it, the same cloud-inspired infrastructure, the way we call it in Azure Stack, which is the stack on the left, where we are taking a lot of the code or the infrastructure code and the automation behind those machines that are running in Azure, which have been battle tested, in production for a while at hyperscale, and we are literally getting all of that code to be the foundation of this Azure Stack that you see on the left. And then we are being thoughtful about a bunch of infrastructure services and platform services that we literally lift and shift from Azure for use in your data center, right? So if you think of basic infrastructure services like virtual machines, virtual networks, storage accounts, service fabric, all of these are infrastructure and platform services which we are getting to you for deployment in your data center. And then the exact same Azure portal is also coming to you for use by your application owners to deploy their applications, right? And then again, the same Windows server or Linux apps could run merrily on top, right? So you see the symmetry between the two stacks, if you will, right? The Microsoft Azure Stack, which is a public cloud offering, and then the Microsoft Azure Stack, which you as an enterprise or even our service provider partners who would love to participate can deploy in their own data centers. And then make no mistake about it, this is all about empowering that application innovation that we started the discussion with, right? So if you think of it from a application owner or developer standpoint, what this symmetric view, right? Azure on the right, Azure Stack on the left. What this does for them is they can build an application, without worrying about where it will actually be deployed, right? And what we are telling them, or what we are telling you guys, our application owners, are that you can build that application, deploy it in Azure or in Azure Stack, depending on what your business requirements are, right? And you would not have to sort of make configuration or code changes for that, right? It's as easy as redirecting that app and saying, yep, instead of Azure, I want to deploy this in Azure Stack. It's the exact same application, right? And we've got some great software which enables the same cloud application model to be used in both contexts. We've seen a lot of interest from customers in this type of solution. For example, there are customers who tell us, gosh, how I wish I could use an Azure-like capability on my own terms in my own data center, because I'm a regulated company. I have restrictions on how much data and what type of data can leave the perimeter of my data center, right? So that's a great scenario where people can say, gosh, I'm just almost mentally going to assume that I'm building an Azure-style application, except that I'm going to deploy it on premises in Azure Stack till such time some of those regulations and constraints disappear, right? And in which case I can ultimately go to Azure. In other cases, we've heard customers telling us, gosh, I'm trying to build an application which has a level of seasonality relative to our business. So I just want to right size and provision the exact amount of infrastructure resources that an application needs, at different points of time in the year. That's a great use case for us to say, gosh, yeah, great. So you deploy a front end in Azure, keep your, if your application has sensitive data, keep that on premises in Azure Stack, no problem. And we've got a distributed cloud application model for you, right? There are other examples where customers are building net new data centers and they're asking us, man, this would be a great opportunity for me to try out some of the new ways of operating and deploying my data center like you guys do in Azure. So again, a phenomenal opportunity to do that. And finally, we've seen some interest from service providers. A lot of our service provider friends also want to participate in the notion of hybrid cloud computing, where customers can go to them as trusted partners, let's say in situations where Azure is not available in a particular geography, right? In which case, if we empower them with all the building blocks to set up an Azure-like offering, right, and offer it to customers in their geography, we've seen a lot of interest from service provider from our service provider customers as well. So all in all, a lot of interest, everything anchored on that notion of just writing an application once and deploying it anywhere, in a hybrid context so that it best meets my needs. Even a lot of our IT pro friends, many of you are telling us, hey, this is cool because I'm getting Azure, but then I can kind of tweak it to the SLA requirements that my business has, right? And I can kind of control it. In many cases, I can build on what I have today, right? So it kind of is a great balance between what an application owner needs, which is the need for speed, and what IT needs, that basic control of the infrastructure, given that they are stewards of the corporate data, right? So we kind of meet the best of both worlds through this offering. I'll just click in a little bit more into the architecture of the Microsoft Azure Stack. So if you go from top to bottom, we've got, of course, a bunch of applications that we want to run on this on-premises cloud platform, be it Windows or Linux. And for that, we are going to provide a set of DevOps tools. All right. So if you think of the Visual Studio experience that application owners are used to, or your developers are used to, great. That's the same experience that they can use to actually build and deploy that application to Azure Stack, just like they would do for Azure, right? It could be Visual Studio or Visual Studio Online. Even the Azure SDK is something that will be part of this offering, again, so that developers can use the exact same set of tools that they would use if they were building an application for Azure, right? And then, of course, there's the portal, which is, again, the exact same Azure portal. The new portal experience is what we're talking about, not the classic Azure portal experience. So they can go to that new portal experience and check out the health of their application, the usage, and all the telemetry behind that application that they might have just deployed to Azure Stack, right? And then we've got this cool thing called the Azure Resource Manager, which I'm sure many of you would be familiar with, which is kind of the thing that helps the application owner codify the application model and the application requirements that they have, right? So this would include the type of infrastructure that they're looking for their application, the type of access controls and role-based access controls that they want to, enable in the application, the identity, the people who are authorized to access the application, and so on and so forth. So they, in effect, codify the application completely or the application model using an Azure Resource Manager provided template, right? Which is basically a set of resource groups in Azure. I'm sure a lot of you might be familiar with these concepts, so they're coming directly from Azure. But that's kind of the thing which makes this notion of this hybrid consistency possible, right? Just write an application once and deploy it anywhere, be it in Azure Stack. And Azure Stack could be an on-premises or on a hoster. So Azure Resource Manager is that thing, right? So you can almost imagine a set of canonical workloads or applications which are codified into standard templates that an application owner can just pick out of a gallery and use, right, to codify that application. And then they go to Visual Studio, do a one-click deployment, done, right? So we want to make it as easy or as consistent or as the same, in effect, as the process that they would use to deploy an application to Azure. And then, like I mentioned, all of the underlying platform and infrastructure services would be exposed so that developers can capture that in the resource groups that they would choose as part of the Azure Resource Manager templates that they want to use to codify the application, right? So we fully expect that in version 1, we would have infrastructure services like virtual machines, virtual machine extensions, virtual networks, vNICs, software load balancing, and storage accounts, or including tables and blobs coming into Azure Stack. We also expect platform services, with Service Fabric being a canonical example of a platform service that developers could use to build higher value applications with built-in availability and so on, right? That Service Fabric brings to the table. And then at the bottom of the stack, just like in Azure, right, we've got a bunch of storage, networking, compute resources, along with the associated automation and management to keep them available, right, in a robust sense, so that they can be delivered up for consumption through the infrastructure and platform layer and into ARM, right, when an application owner comes down and says, I want to deploy something. So the cloud-inspired infrastructure row at the bottom is the place where the infrastructure is kind of set up, ready to be consumed when applications require it. So next, you will see a demonstration video that showcases the exact same application deployment experience across Azure Stack and Azure. So you'll see a multi-tier line of business application that is deployed on Azure, and then the exact same approach being used to deploy that application to Azure Stack as well.
Recently at Build, Mark Krasinovich demonstrated the new cloud application model in Azure for developers. Now let's take a look at the new cloud application model from an IT perspective. Here we have an application called Contoso Expenses running in Azure. And in summary, this cloud app is composed of a web app, IaaS virtual machines, and more. Now drilling in, we have all these different types of resources that have been templated and are managed as a single cloud app. It consists of an IaaS virtual machine, network interfaces, public IP addresses, virtual networks, PaaS SQL databases, and storage, all managed as a single entity. Now, going into storage, you can see options for tables, queues, blobs, and more. And even clicking on blobs, you can see the blob service endpoint resides in Azure in the East US region. Now that we've deployed this application, we want to ensure that we delegate appropriate access. So I'm going to go back to our resources group and I'm going to add a new user. Now take a look at the new roles. We've got owners, contributors for App Insights, BizTalk, MySQL, and more. Think about what's happening in here. You don't have to have individually managed permissions for all the resources that comprise a cloud app. With the Azure Resource Model, we're managing IaaS virtual machines, PaaS databases, network and storage from all one place. How awesome is that? Now, wouldn't it be great if we could deploy the same cloud app running in Azure using the same resource groups and role-based authentication in your data centers? That's the Microsoft Azure Stack. Now, I've switched to PowerShell to show you how with 4 lines of script, you can deploy this cloud app either to Azure or to your data center running the Azure Stack. In this case, I'm going to set it to deploy to my Chicago data center. Since this process takes a minute, I've already deployed it. Let's take our first look at Azure Stack. It looks just like Azure, doesn't it? It does because it's the same. Here's the same expenses app running in the Azure Stack. Here's the same summary view that we saw in Azure and the same resources. In fact, if we go to split screen, we can compare it with Azure. The app deployed in Microsoft Azure has a blue background, while on the Azure Stack has a black one. Look at the resources, the same virtual machines, the same NICs, public IPs, web apps, and blob storage. Azure Stack, it's what you've been asking for. It's Azure in your data center.
So in terms of resources and next step, we encourage you to learn more about our vision for the Microsoft Azure Stack. You should go to the URL that you see on your screen. Just learn more on the art of the possible and what you can actually do with the Azure Stack. We encourage you to try the Azure Resource Manager today, right? Take a look at all the templates and all the resource groups, be it SharePoint Forms, be it SQL and the like, so that you're already up to speed, so that the moment Azure Stack comes up, you can just use the same types of technologies and capabilities to deploy those workloads in an Azure Stack environment in your own data center, right? So just try Azure Resource Manager, try a bunch of the underlying infrastructure services, familiarize yourself if you're not already with virtual networks, virtual machines extensions, and so on and so forth, because all of that knowledge will literally carry over to Azure Stack. And then look for the Azure Stack technology preview later this year. So our intent is to bring you all of this capability in a controlled sense so that you can start playing around with it in a dev test environment, right? A great use case for Azure Stack would be that you try out a lot of stuff in Azure, right? And when you're ready, you kind of deploy it to Azure Stack in production. So, just combining steps 2 and 3, if you kind of get more and more familiar with Azure, you can actually make more productive use of the Azure Stack technology preview that is coming later this year. So with that, I want to really thank you for your time. I hope this was a good introduction of the Microsoft Azure Stack, and we will share more and more details about the Azure Stack as we deliver our technology releases through the rest of this calendar year and into next calendar year as well. Thanks again for your time.